if you'd like to speak.
This standing up looks more imposing. I just wanted to say off the bat, I left off the part about healthcare that was in the abstract. So if you're really here for that reason, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I think you'll get the gist of it anyway. So I would entitle my paper Dooyeweerd's Conception of Societal Sphere Sovereignty, with an application to the question of the status and tax-based support of education. A decade ago, at the centennial commemoration of Abraham Kuyper's lectures here at Princeton Seminary, I believe it was Nicholas Waltersdorf, who said something to the effect that while Kuyper developed a theory of the sovereignty that spheres possess, he hadn't exactly developed a theory of the spheres that were sovereign. And that was somewhat reflected in what Dr. Graham had said. Waltersdorf cited Kuyper's disparate use of sphere to refer to various specific and to a variety of general classes of ideas, activities, and communities. Kuyper even refers to the sphere of the individual person and the sphere of self-consciousness. Herman Dooyeweerd significantly removes the theoretical ambiguity in his own development of Kuyper's sphere sovereignty. Dooyeweerd distinguishes modal spheres and societal spheres and their respective sovereignties. He also works out a taxonomy of societal communities, distinguishing between what he calls natural institutions, such as marriage and family, differentiated and undifferentiated organized institutions, such as church and state in the first case, and tribes and guilds in the second, it's undifferentiated, and non-institutional voluntary associations, such as professional and social clubs. This is in his work, Christian Idea of Social Institutions. It's also in the critique. In the following, I outline Dooyeweerd's conception of societal sphere sovereignty and offer a concluding application of his conception to the question of the status of education and the propriety of its tax-based support. Dooyeweerd holds that the principle of societal sphere sovereignty is rooted in what he calls the ground motive of the Christian religion, which he summarizes as creation, fall, and redemption through Christ Jesus. In general, a ground motive is an expression, both individual and communal, of one of two possible basic commitments or orientations. One of these is characterized by trust in the true God revealed in the Scriptures, the other by unbelief, that is, by an apostate faith, in something as divine other than the true God, which is idolatry. These two possible religious commitments, in either a direction toward or away from God, are in an irreconcilable antithesis to each other. This antithesis cuts through every thought, word, and deed, even because of remaining sin, for those who believe in God through trust in Christ. To say that any given theoretical viewpoint is rooted in an apostate or idolatrous ground motive is not a comment on the regenerate status of or a personal attack against the individual espousing such a view. Our theories may be, in principle, at odds with our deepest religious orientation. Dooyeweerd is emphatic that ground motive critique is always first and foremost self-critique. But Dooyeweerd distinguishes three historical expressions of the unbiblical ground motive in Western culture. There's a Greek or pagan matter-form ground motive. There is a medieval Roman Catholic or scholastic nature-grace ground motive. There's a modern or humanistic nature-freedom ground motive. These three non-Christian historical ground motives all display an inner contradiction or dialectical tension between two opposing principles in which each pole is itself ultimate and no resolution or genuine synthesis is possible. Crucial to Dooyeweerd's conception of societal sphere sovereignty is that the creational or structural element of the Christian ground motive is the creational element of creation, fall, redemption. That this recognizes a genuinely basic diversity in creation, for God created everything after its own kind. And intimately related to this idea of the diversity in creation is the idea of order and law. That is, God created each kind of thing according to its own kind of law, by which he continues to sustain and govern them. Within this creational diversity, there are two levels of structure that Dooyeweerd distinguishes. The first level is that of modality. The second is that of individuality. Modalities are ways in which something exists and is experienced in the continuity of temporal reality. Each modality has a core meaning, an original sense that is proper to itself, and cannot be explained exclusively in terms of any other modal sense, and by which each modality may be theoretically distinguished. Each modality is also subject to its own particular kind of law. Accordingly, each modality is said to be irreducible. No modality can be reduced to any other. Dooyeweerd distinguishes 15 modalities altogether. These include arithmetic quantity, spatial extension, kinetic movement, physical energy, biotic life, psychic feeling, analytical distinction, historical culture, lingual symbol, social intercourse, economic thrift, aesthetic harmony, juridical justice, moral love, and fiducial certitude. Might be the only one to quote this for you in case you've never heard them. These modalities, however, are never in real isolation from each other. Dooyeweerd highlights the importance of modal or intermodal analogies, concepts that attest to the connection between modalities. Dooyeweerd develops what he calls modal universality in terms of prior and posterior and order encompassing all modal meanings as inherent within each modality. Moreover, in concrete experience, all modalities exist in an unbreakable mutual coherence. Every individual temporal thing always functions within all the modalities, some things functioning subjectively or actively in certain modalities, and objectively or passively in other modalities. The second level of structure in the diversity of created reality that Dooyeweerd distinguishes, he calls individuality structures. Structures of individuality cover a broad range of concrete phenomena, such as events and what we normally think of as things, including humanly formed things, such as artifacts and societal communities. For our purposes, we'll focus on how Dooyeweerd articulates the natures of and relations among various societal communities. Modalities are important in recognizing the distinct natures of these diverse things, societal communities. Each thing has what Dooyeweerd calls a qualifying function. Some things' qualifying function is directly related to its most characteristic modality. This qualifying function specially characterizes the way something functions in all the other modalities and determines its internal or intrinsic nature and purpose. Humanly formed things, such as societal communities, also have what Dooyeweerd calls a founding function. Some things' founding function is directly related to the modality that most characterizes the basis upon which it was formed. Dooyeweerd distinguishes various kinds of societal communities relative to their respective founding and qualifying functions. The communities that may be distinguished in this way, such as marriage, family, church, state, business, labor union, social club, etc., these constitute the various societal spheres. The foregoing description of a theoretical account of creational diversity is proper to the Christian ground In terms of a non-Christian ground motive, one tends, whether implicitly or explicitly, toward idolatrous reductionism and taking some modality, something of creation, as the origin of the rest of reality. For views of societal order, such reductionisms result in the absolutization or totalizing of some sphere, often that of the state. Failing to recognize the true God as creator, non-Christian ground motives thereby fail to recognize a genuinely basic diversity in creation. Dooyeweerd, on the other hand, insists on the absolute sovereignty of God alone, not some reduced sphere or modality. And it is on this basis that the delegated sovereignty of each societal sphere is understood, on the basis of God's sovereignty. Dooyeweerd states, quote, "Sphere sovereignty guarantees each societal sphere an intrinsic nature and law of life, and within this guarantee it provides the basis for an original sphere of authority and competence, derived not from the authority of any other sphere, but directly delegated from the sovereign authority of God," close quote. This God-given sovereignty or authority and competence within each societal sphere is direct or immediate, that is not mediated by some other sphere. Dooyeweerd contrasts this conception with that of autonomy. He insists that genuine societal sphere sovereignty is not equivalent to functional decentralization or subsidiarity. He says that such a conception as decentralization or subsidiarity, quote, would mean that the different spheres of society as independent parts must be incorporated into the state while retaining a certain autonomy. The task of the state would then be decentralized by creating municipalities, provinces, and other parts of the state alongside local agencies endowed with a public legal regulatory jurisdiction. Close quote. Autonomy in that sense implies a part-whole relationship. Dooyeweerd is emphatic that neither society itself nor any societal sphere, not even the state, constitutes a whole of which other spheres are but parts. Rather, each societal sphere is a whole unto itself. This also rules out any kind of hierarchical arrangement among the various societal spheres. Not within a sphere, there might be a hierarchical arrangement, but rules out among them, so it doesn't put the state atop or any other. Dooyeweerd affirms that, quote, "None of these temporal spheres can be derived from or valued lower than any other," unquote. And since only derived competency can be based on positive law, not only can the other societal spheres never properly be made parts of the state, but the state or any other sphere can never be what creates the boundaries of sovereignty between spheres. Dooyeweerd's criterion, then, for recognizing a sovereign societal sphere is its distinct intrinsic nature, and the intrinsic nature of the societal sphere is determined by its founding and qualifying functions. The founding and qualifying functions, which determine the basis upon which a societal sphere is formed and the way it functions in all the modalities, and its distinct intrinsic nature and purpose, which distinguishes it from all other societal spheres, Dooyeweerd collectively calls a societal sphere's inner structural principle. According to its inner structural principle, Dooyeweerd characterizes the state as a public legal community of rulers and subjects, or government and citizenry, with a monopoly on power of the sword within a defined territory. This sword power within a territory is the historical founding function of the state. Sword power here means lethal coercion, that is, the ability to achieve compliance upon the threat of death. Taxation is included in this exercise of state coercion. As a public legal community, the qualifying function of the state is within the juridical modality. While every sovereign sphere is a sphere of authority, that is, of lawmaking competence, the laws of any given non-state societal community have no proper jurisdiction outside their own sphere. This is just as true of the state. The state's sphere of competence is distinctly qualified, and thus intrinsically limited by its so-called public character. Dooyeweerd affirms that, quote, every form of legal power, that of the state also, is structurally delimited by the inner nature of the sphere of life within which it is exercised. Close quote. Therefore, the norm holding for the state's proper activities must be that of public justice. This is in keeping with Dooyeweerd's affirmation of the state as res publica, that is, the public entity. The genuine state is not an object of private ownership, but rather is held in common without respect to membership in any other societal community. So the justice of the state is never, not even ideally, a generic justice. The norm of justice as it applies to the state must be delimited by the state's intrinsic public nature, and so holds with exclusive regard to the public legal sphere. There are many injustices, then, which the state has no competence to address. Dooyeweerd explicates justice in terms of retribution. That is, in the classical sense of giving to each their proper due. However, justice has various modal analogies. We may speak of trustworthiness, that is, due confidence, in terms of the fiducial qualification, or we may speak of paying financially what we owe in terms of an economic qualification. Yet in every case, the original sense of justice is retribution. This retribution takes on a distinct qualification in the various societal spheres according to each societal sphere's inner structural principle. Dooyeweerd calls the Christian conception of retribution as a public legal norm within the sphere of the state, a, quote, bulwark of the reformational principle of sphere sovereignty, close quote, particularly in its application to penalties in criminal law. The responsibility of the state, in Dooyeweerd's view, for bringing criminals to public justice and the sort of penalties proper to the state must not be confused with, for instance, the responsibility of parents and the sort of justice that should obtain within the familial sphere, which is morally qualified. According to the state's inner structural principle, Dooyeweerd distinguishes two kinds of law proper to the state, namely civil law, this is a quote, namely civil law and public law, the first being a state law regulating the civil coordinational relations of individuals as such, the latter being an intercommunal law of the state as a public community. These two are the original spheres of competency of the state in the domain of law formation, close quote. Civil law, then, concerns the liberty and equality of persons as persons before state law. Civil law also constitutes a public legal recognition of the inter-individual legal agreements without regard to any particular communal membership or specific characteristic of the person, such as age, health, gender, ethnicity, religion, or economic status. Public law, on the other hand, concerns the organization of the state and the respective rights and duties of both government and citizens within that public legal community. So, for instance, whether the government is representational and which citizens may elect representatives would be addressed in public law. These two kinds of law, civil and public, proper to the state by virtue of the state's distinct interstructural principle, are to be sharply distinguished from the multiple so-called private spheres of law, which are exclusively within the jurisdiction of each respective sovereign societal sphere. Dooyeweerd holds that the content of state law must be determined in keeping with the salus publica, that is, the common good. And yet, Dooyeweerd says that the common good, quote, has at all times been the slogan of state absolutism. Close quote. Dooyeweerd is again emphatic that only upon the Christian conception of societal sphere sovereignty, in terms of which the state is understood to be intrinsically limited according to its inner structural principle, a conception which has, quote, fundamentally broken with any absolutization of either state or individual, can we grasp the principle of the common good as a truly juridical principle of public law, close quote. In other words, the common good as a principle for determining state law must also be intrinsically qualified in a public legal sense. So as it concerns state law, the common good must never have, for instance, an economic sense. This is also to say that there is no single common good for society, but many common goods for which the state's responsibility is exclusively the public legal dimension. For the many and various common goods in society, differentiated spheres have their own sovereign responsibilities. Besides rejecting any statist or other collectivistic view, Dooyeweerd also distinguishes his conception of societal sphere sovereignty from that of an individualistic or libertarian societal order. While Dooyeweerd acknowledges that that classical liberalism was significantly influenced in its development by Christianity, he traces the basis of many of its controlling assumptions to humanistic ground motive of nature freedom. Upon this motive, classical liberalism holds to the absolute sovereignty of the individual person. In such a conception, the state and other societal communities as such have neither responsibilities nor rights, for they're merely fictions of inter-individual agreement. In contrast, Dooyeweerd's view of the normativity of an intrinsic limit within societal spheres, an individualistic conception constitutes a mere external or extrinsic limit upon communities. This mere extrinsic limitation is not only misconceived with regard to the genuinely basic diversity of creation in both its modality and individuality structures, but is utterly insufficient in practice to restrain a dialectical swing towards some collectivism. Historically, classical liberalism has been unable to withstand the pressure of an absolutistic conception of the so-called common good that is not itself qualified by the limit of the state's intrinsic nature, for example, as in the welfare state. In light of this outline of Dooyeweerd's conception of societal sphere sovereignty, we can address the question of the status of education, or in principle any other societal activity, and consider the propriety of its tax-based support. As previously mentioned, taxation is an exercise of the state's coercive power. This is the case whether tax-based support for some activity occurs in the form of resources allocated for direct state operation through an agency of state, or through some kind of subsidy to autonomous agencies, or through some kind of stipend or voucher to the participants or recipients of some program or service, or through any combination of these. What is called refundable tax credit to agencies or recipients is equivalent to subsidy or stipend inasmuch as the amount refunded exceeds that which was paid by the refundee. However, non-refundable tax credits to non-state institutions and participants in some activity would not constitute tax-based support, since by definition no tax is funding the activity. In any case, When we consider whether, according to Dooyeweerd's conception of societal sphere sovereignty, some activity is proper to the state, that is, within its sphere of competence, and thus whether the state should support an activity through taxation in whatever form, we must consider the respective founding and qualifying functions of the activity. In this way, we can determine its intrinsic nature and interstructural principle. We've already outlined Dooyeweerd's conception of the interstructural principle of the state. If it turns out that, for instance, education has an identical intrinsic nature to that of the state, namely public justice by coercion, then we can conclude that tax-based support of such an activity is compatible with Dooyeweerd's view. However, if it turns out that upon consideration of its interstructural principle, an activity, such as education, possesses its own intrinsic nature, distinct from that of the state, then we can conclude that tax-based support for it is incompatible with Dooyeweerd's conception of societal sphere sovereignty. Now, education as such is a ubiquitous societal activity basic to all kinds of human living, from toilet training to job training. Each sphere, each kind of societal community functions by a wide variety of taught and learned skills. Education, in the broadest sense of learning, does not seem to have a single intrinsic nature, but rather is something that may be variously manifested according to the inner life of each and every sphere. But for our purposes, we have in mind the differentiated institution or organized community of a school for children, for educating children. Dooyeweerd indeed recognizes the organized community of a school as a sovereign sphere and specifies its historical founding function and moral qualifying function. According to the interstructural principle of a school community, Dooyeweerd holds that, quote, the moral bond is that between pupils and their teachers, founded in the cultural formative power of teachers, close quote. He further characterizes the school as supplemental and optional, distinguishing it from the fundamentally irreplaceable and natural or biotically founded and morally qualified parental educational task. However, the spiritual direction of the non-parental schooling normatively continues to belong to the parental competence, in keeping with the structural principle of the family. In conclusion, it appears then, although one could analyze its interstructural principle more fully, the school, as a sovereign sphere, while relating closely to the sphere of the family, does not fall within the competence of the state, and is therefore not legitimately supported by any form of taxation according to Dooyeweerd's conception of societal sphere sovereignty. Thanks.
Yeah, we have some 10, 15 minutes for questions. So.
Okay.
Thanks, Greg. I have a couple of questions. You just, and I'll list them, and they're all connected to something. You said at one point that Dooyeweerd speaks of the common good. He's speaking of a multitude of common goods, which is completely illogical. That's not. There's no longer the common good. There are multiple common goods. If you're catching my drift.
Okay.
So what I'm not clear about, first of all, on that question is whether or not you're talking about a variety of goods related to specific communities or specific spheres. If that's what he's talking about, or if he actually is talking about the common good in the classical sense of the common good. So that's the first question I have. The second question I have is with regard to your concern about taxation and so on. I'm wondering if you're suggesting, and I think you are, suggesting that the derivative function has no redistributive role, period. And I'm getting the sense that you're from that assertion moving to, along with the fact that you're saying that the school is not part of the state, you're saying that that is not, since it has no redistributive function, and then I'm assuming that's what you would have said with healthcare and welfare and so on and so forth. Now, there have been other neo-Calvinists like Jonathan Chaplin who have said, who have said that justice, when it goes through, it does have redistributive, because of course the state must rule on the economy and that sort of thing as a matter of public justice, and so on. So those are my questions.
The no single common good is an implication that I draw from Dooyeweerd's understanding of the common good, and the way I would try to help make sense of that for you is by saying, what kind of qualification does a monolithic common good have? And if you're going to say it's unqualified, or it takes on different qualifications, as soon as you see it in terms of that here the common good has some qualification and it's not a universal, that is an absolutistic qualification, then that's my point.
But is that necessarily a problem, or is that simply a limitation of the Dooyeweerd analysis, perhaps?
Well, it's a general, it's a theory. It's a question everyone has to answer. When they say there's some kind of common good, well, one, their conception of society is society's one thing. And so how are you characterizing this one thing? Where does this one thing come from? So Dooyeweerd rejects the idea of society being one thing. There is no one thing that society is. It's many things, many wholes. And for each of those wholes, there's a different good that's differently qualified. There are just multiple goods in that sense. So it's common in the sense of not being absolutistic, but in terms of the spheres being common. The spheres themselves are common. It's a debate over the term common, but it merits more thought. But let me address the redistributive idea real briefly. I don't see, he may use the word once or twice and discuss it, but I haven't. It's something I need to think more about. I've seen views of redistributive justice in the sort of neo-Calvinistic discussion that I think are in complete antipathy to Dooyeweerd's understanding of justice. So the state, so in that sense, I can't see how the state has a redistributive calling, justice-wise. The state, it's not as though the state is not involved sort of in the life of other spheres, but its involvement in society as, altogether, all the different parts of, well, they're not parts, but all the different spheres, societal spheres in society, is a public legal one. So it remains strictly qualified public legally in its involvement in other spheres. So you say, well, what role does the state have in the market? A public legal one. So you have to say, well, where is there a compromise of public law, or in that case, maybe civil law, but state law? Where is there a violation of that aspect within any given other other sphere? That's the question. Yeah.
You may have answered the question, but are you saying that Dooyeweerd in fact reached this conclusion with regard to